Over the last couple of weeks, I've been looking for a better logging system. I've used many different logging systems, either at work or at home in my home lab. And having a mix of virtual machines, other devices, containers, custom code has made it a little bit challenging to find the right one. And while I thought my last logging system was the one I was going to settle on, I decided to move to something else. So I've recently switched over to Grafana Loki. Grafana Loki is a scalable, highly available, multi-tenant log aggregation system like Prometheus. It's designed to be cost-effective and very easy to operate. So there are a lot of similarities between Loki and Prometheus, and that's why it's been coined Prometheus, but for logs. One thing they share, and one thing that's really awesome, is that they both use Grafana. Now, Grafana is a way to query and visualize almost anything, which seems like a great fit for logs as well. So if you're already using Grafana or investigating it, Loki will fit right in. So how does this work? Well, there are three parts really to Grafana Loki. First, there's the agent. The agent's name is Promtail, and Promtail works in a push configuration and not a pull configuration. So that means the agent is going to push logs into Loki rather than query devices and pull it. And so this one or many agents, which is pushing logs, will push them into Loki itself. And Loki is where all of these are stored. But once your logs and data is inside of Loki, you can then use Grafana to get it out, to query it, and to visualize it. I know this might sound a little complicated and hard to set up, but actually it's surprisingly easy. So that's what we're going to cover today. So first we'll configure Loki and get it up and running so it can accept some logs. Then we'll install our agent, Promtail, so we can push logs into Loki. And then we'll get Grafana up and running and we'll configure the Loki plugin so we can start querying logs. And after we get all this working, we'll explore a few different ways to get logs into our system. We'll talk about scraping logs from a machine. And then we'll talk about scraping logs from a Docker host, which is really awesome because all you have to do is set it up once and you can collect all the logs from all of the containers running on that machine. And it only takes a small amount of config. And then we'll touch briefly on how to set up a syslog endpoint so you can send logs from any device that supports syslog. And then we'll also touch on how to send logs from a whole entire Kubernetes cluster. But I'll go easy on the Kubernetes. I don't want you to fall asleep. And if any of that sounds good to you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. And like all of my videos, I'll have a link in the description to my documentation site where you can copy and paste all of this config. So what do you need to get started? Really, you just need a machine that can run Docker. That can be a Windows PC or a Mac or a server or even a Raspberry Pi. Any of these are fine to run Docker to be able to spin these containers up. And if you need help setting up Docker or Docker Compose, that's also in my documentation. So once you have Docker running, you'll just want to make sure it's working by running docker-v. See that? You're good. Next, make sure you're inside of a directory. I don't know where else you would be, but just make sure you're in the right one. So we're going to create 3 directories, one for each of our containers. So first we're going to do a mkdir Promtail, and that's our agent for our logs. Then we'll make a directory for Loki. Then we'll make a directory for Grafana. Next, we'll want to create a Docker Compose file for all 3 of these services. So we'll do a touch docker-compose.yml for YAML, and then we can edit this file. So what goes in the file? Inside of the file goes our Loki stack. So now when I say Loki stack, I'm referring to Promtail, Loki, and Grafana. And here's the configuration that we're going to use. So let's talk about it real quick. So this is a typical Docker Compose file. We're going to use Docker Compose's API's version of 3. Then we're going to create a network called Loki. Now this is important because all 3 of these containers inside of the stack are going to share this network name. So the first service is called Loki. And the image we're going to use is Grafana/Loki, and then we're pinning it to the latest version. Then we're going to create a volume for it. So this volume can be anywhere on this machine that you're on. But I'm saying that mine is in home/serveradmin/docker volumes/Loki. And then we're mapping that to the inside of that container that runs etc/Loki. Then we're exposing some ports, 3100 on the outside, 3100 on the inside, and then we're saying restart unless stopped. And this helps if the container starts crashing. Next is a command when this container starts up, and we're saying -config.file equals etc/Loki loki-config.yaml. Now this is our Loki config, and we'll have this in a minute. But if you notice, this is going to map to the inside of /Loki here, and that mounts to the host. So that's why we're going to put a config file there here in a little bit, but I'll show you that here in a second. And we're saying, hey, this container belongs to this network called Loki. The next service in our stack is Promtail. Now remember, this is our logging agent. So here we're saying, use the image Grafana, Promtail, and then a version, and we're pinning it to that version. Then we're mounting a few volumes here. So we're mounting varlog from our machine to varlog within that container. And then we're mounting /home/server-admin/docker volumes/promtail on this machine to the containers /promtail. And this is just for some persistence here. And again, we're saying restart unless stopped. And then again, we're using the command of -config file equals promtail-config. So same idea as Grafana Loki up there. We're going to specify a config file for this to use, so when it mounts up and runs this command, it can use that config file at runtime. I'll show you that here in a minute. Next is Grafana. So this is actually going to spin up Grafana. This one we are pinning the latest because that's what Grafana says to do. Next, we're setting a user of 1000. Now this helps with permission on the volume that Grafana needs to write to. Now the way you can find this is just running ID, and you can see your ID right here, the UID of 1000. Now again, that might be different from you, but take that volume and plug it into the config. Then speaking of volumes and persistence, this is where our volume is going to be stored for Grafana. So on the outside, or the host, it's server-admin/docker volumes/Grafana. And then on the inside, it's var/lib/Grafana. So this will persist Grafana itself, so that every time you reboot the container, you don't lose your configuration for Grafana. And next is ports of 3000 on the outside and 3000 on the inside. Now, I have a quick comment here that says you might need to change this, and this applies to every port. 3000 is a pretty common port, so is 3100. So if you need to change those, you would change it on the outside here, on the left side. This is the one that's exposed on your container. And 3000 is a very common port for me because I run a lot of node stuff and they all use 3000. So I had a comment here specifically for myself, but this applies to every port you see in the configuration here. Remember, change the left side. Left side is your configuration. Right side is the container's configuration, which you can't change unless you rebuild the container. And then we see restart unless stopped again. And then networks, Loki. So this ties them all together. So they're all using the Loki network so they can all communicate to each other within this stack. So let's take this configuration here and we'll copy it. And we'll go back into our server for this Docker compose file and we'll paste our configuration in there. Then we'll save it. Then if you do an ls, you should see your folders there. Now you see a couple other folders that I have there, but you should see Grafana, Loki, and Promtail there. And then our Docker compose file that we created. But before we start it up, we need a couple additional configs. Remember I mentioned earlier, we need config for Promtail and we need config for Loki. And that's specified here. So let's look at a file called loki-config.yaml. Here's your configuration for Loki. 100% of this is the default setting that they say to use for Loki. It has some configurations for servers, ports, some paths within the container, schema config, and a whole bunch of other configuration. Now you shouldn't need to change anything in here unless you have a specialized setup or specialized needs for other systems that you're running. So let's copy this configuration and then go inside of our Loki folder and create a loki-config.yaml file. Once we create it, then we can edit it, and we're gonna paste that configuration into there. So let's save that and close. And now we'll need to do the same thing for Promtail. Let's go one folder up, then go into Promtail, and let's do a touch promtail-config.yaml. Then we can edit it, and here is our Promtail config. And remember, Promtail is our agent to scrape logs. So if we look here, some more configuration for the server, what port it's listening on, a positions key that points to a file name that points to a YAML file within the container. Then we'll have a client's URL with Loki at 3100/Loki/API/v1/push. So this is the endpoint where it's going to push logs. And it could refer to it by Loki because it's within this stack, and we can refer to it by name. And then we have some configuration for how to scrape logs. Now, this should be a comment, but local machine logs we're going to configure first. So we're going to scrape logs from this local machine and then push them into Loki. And it's saying the target is localhost, and the job is called varlogs, and the path to varlog and take all logs within varlog. And then some additional configuration commented out here that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So let's copy this, paste it into promtail-config, and let's save it. And if we do an ls within Promtail, we should see our Promtail Config. And if we go up into Loki, do the same thing, we should see our Loki-config. If we go up into Grafana and look in there, we shouldn't see anything. So let's go up one more level. And now we should see our Docker Compose file that we created. So now let's spin this whole entire stack up. The way I typically do it is docker-compose up-d-force recreate. There's a million ways you can do it. That's the way I do it here. So if we run this command, this will now create our whole entire stack. So hold down Loki, pulling down Promtail, and it's pulling down Grafana. Now it's creating those containers. Done, done, done. So it looks like we're running. If we do a Docker PS really quick, just to make sure, we should see all three of these running. So Promtail started 10 seconds ago, Loki started 10 seconds ago, and Grafana started 10 seconds ago. So we're looking good. So how do we know it's working? Well, we go to the IP address of this server and we can go to port 3100/metrics. And you can see here, I have some metrics already. You can also go to /ready to see if it's ready. Now, obviously it should say ready if it's ready. If it doesn't say ready, it'll usually say it's waiting 15 seconds and checking the ingester again. So just keep refreshing this page. So this is a good sign. Our ingester's ready and we are getting metrics as shown in this endpoint. So now we can actually log in to Grafana. So how do we do that? Well, it's just port 3000. So 3000 is where Grafana lives. So if you haven't logged into Grafana before, the username and password is admin. Then you'll be prompted to create a new password. And then once you sign in, you have Grafana. So if you're not familiar with Grafana, this really isn't the tutorial for Grafana. I might have one in the future, but you get a platform for visualizing logs, metrics, or really any data. But we can also query that data, and that's exactly what we're gonna do with our Loki stack. So the first thing we need to do is actually set up our data source for Loki so that we can query the logs. So let's go into settings here, then let's click add data source, and we should see Loki down here. So let's select Loki, and in here, very little configuration, but the URL of our endpoint to query. Now it's suggesting HTTP localhost 3100, but if you remember in our configuration, it's an HTTP Loki 3100. Now I think either will work, but I think they recommend to use Loki. And once we have that filled in, we can actually save and test. So now our data source is connected and labels are found, so that's good. So now let's explore this data, or query our data in here. So let's go to explore, and you want to make sure that your data source is set to Loki here. Now, how do we query? Now, teaching you logql, which is the log query language for Grafana, is kind of out of scope for this tutorial. But I will give you some examples on how to query data, and it's really straightforward, at least for the simple queries, because they suggest labels for you. You get kind of IntelliSense. So first we'll start with the curly bracket, and right away it's saying file name or job. So these are tags from Promtail that it's sending into Loki, and now Loki and Grafana are recognizing that. So let's say job, let's choose job. What job did we have? var logs, and var logs was in our Promtail configuration. And then if we hit enter, don't just hit enter, but hit control enter. See, enter is gonna create a line break, but just hit control enter, and right away we can query. So these are the logs coming from this machine right here, var logs. We got logs from this machine doing almost nothing at all. And so you can see all kinds of logs in here. So you can see Juno kernel, so Juno is the name of this machine. You can see there looks like some info messages here, some warning messages here, and a lot of logs that may or may not make sense to you, depending on the type of logging you're used to looking at. You can actually see one here, there's an error here. And so we can search for strings within here too, but you'll always have to remember that you have to select first by a tag. So I think the way that we search these logs for a loose string is the intuitive pipe equals, and then a string in quotes. So I see down there lots of Junos, but I see Docker. Let's search everything within here for Docker. And here we go. So we just filter this now to Docker. You can see how fast we can query through these logs. We can drill into these logs, look at additional metadata. We can include in our filter or exclude from our filter. Well, we just filtered out this entire log that we're in. So we don't want to say not job. There we go. Now, if you're interested in doing some more advanced querying, I highly recommend checking out their logql syntax. But really, it's not that complex. For me, most of the time, I'm looking for a needle in the haystack. I'm looking for a specific phrase or keywords within my logs, and then I'm able to narrow down and figure out maybe what the problem is. So this is cool, but this is only for this machine's logs, which may or may not be helpful. If you remember in Promtail, we had some additional configuration commented out. That was configuration for our Docker containers. This is where it gets really cool, because currently the way that you check for Docker logs is you do Docker logs, then choose your container. We want to say Heimdall, we say Docker logs Heimdall. We don't see any errors there. So then we say Docker logs, and let's choose another one. We can choose Portainer. See some errors or some logs there, and then we can do Docker logs uptime Kuma. Check out uptime Kuma, and it has lots of errors. This isn't efficient or fun. So to make this more fun and more efficient, we can actually configure Promtail to log all of the standard out, all of these logs that we see here, to Loki in one piece of configuration. Super cool. So let's go back into Promtail and let's edit this config. Now I'll bring this up in VS Code so you can see a little bit better. But instead of scraping logs from the machine, let's actually now scrape logs from Docker. So this is saying, hey, the job name is called Docker. There's a pipeline stage called Docker. And then we're going to create a label called Docker. And then we're going to grab all the logs from Docker/containers, and then everything within here, every subfolder that has the file name of -json.log. So this does exist, but we need to make one more configuration. But let's get this in place first. So let's copy this. Let's get rid of our Promtail config, or we could have uncommented that out. And let's update it with our Docker logs. And we'll get rid of the host machine logs. Arguably, you can keep them there, totally up to you. But let's save this and close out of here. So in order to log all of our containers logs to Loki, we actually need to install a Docker driver or a plugin for Docker so that we can push all of those logs to Loki. And so there is a plugin to do this, and it's actually really cool and super simple to spin up. So to do it, we need to install the Grafana Loki Docker driver client. And to do that, it's just as simple as running this command right here. So docker plugin install grafana/loki docker driver latest. So this is the container. Alias is Loki, and grant all permissions. I know that sounds scary, but that's how we get access to all of these logs to send them into Loki. So let's grab this, go back into our machine, and then let's run this. So this pulled down the container and configured the driver for us. There's one more thing we'll need to do. First, just check to make sure it's installed. So docker plugins ls, and we should see Loki here. So the Loki logging driver and enabled is true. Next, if we go back to where we configured the driver, it mentions in here we need to change a couple of things. So we're gonna have to configure the daemon config, the daemon.json, located in etc/docker on this machine. So we can configure it in two ways. There's a shorthand version, and then there's the configuration with some additional options. So there's the Loki server, and then there's the Loki batch size. So how big is the batch of logs to push? And then for our configuration, for our daemon.json, for Docker, it's gonna be log driver is Loki, log options, and then inside of this object, we have a property Loki URL, which is the URL of our server that we're on. And here we can refer to it as localhost. So you should be able to copy and paste this, no problem. And then the batch size of 400 again. So let's copy this. And remember, it said that we need to update the Docker's daemon.json and etc/docker. So on our server or machine, we should be able to edit etc/docker daemon.json. Now, this file may or may not exist, so you'll just want to edit it. And if it's not there, it'll create it. And here, we're going to paste our options. Save this. Then it says, after changing this file, we'll need to restart the Docker daemon for the changes to take effect. All newly created containers from the host will then send logs to Loki via the driver. So keep that in mind, newly created. So we have some containers running, so we might have to recreate them, but that's super easy with a command. But the most important piece here is that we need to restart the Docker daemon. So we should be able to run sudo systemctl restart, and we should be able to choose Docker. Okay, it looks like it restarted Docker, docker-v, just to make sure it's running, and it is. Okay, so let's go back to Grafana now, really quick. So if we go back to Grafana, refresh to make sure it's working, and make sure you're in Explorer, go back into our queries, we don't see additional labels yet. So we should have one here called Docker and containers and a whole bunch. But remember I said in the documentation, it said only for newly created containers. So let's actually recreate our containers that we're running. So in order to recreate these, at least for me, I have all of my Docker Compose files within a folder. So if I go into Heimdall, I should have my Docker Compose file, and I can run docker-compose force recreate. So I'll recreate my Heimdall container. And let's do the same for my uptime Kuma. And let's do the same for file browser. And that should be good. So let's do a docker ps to see what's running. So I have containers running. I see that some are recreated and restarted. So now let's go back in Grafana. We go back to Grafana and we go into our query. When we do a curly bracket, now we see some additional labels. So this is really cool. So we can say container name equals, and it will suggest one. So container name equals Heimdall, and control enter, and we can see the logs from Heimdall right here. So this just happened. Really cool, really cool. Okay, so let's go back, and if you hit control space at any time, you'll get IntelliSense or suggestions, just like you would in any IDE or VS Code. Let's choose file browser, hit enter, control enter. I am hitting control enter, but control is broken on my keyboard. I need a new keyboard. Keep telling myself that. But control enter, the other control enter, and we can see our logs from file browser. Awesome. I have an error here, but that's expected. That was for my demo. And then if we look, and what was the last one? Uptime Kuma. Let's see how he's doing. Control enter, and we can see our logs here. Really cool. And you can actually combine these logs too. If you want to say uptime Kuma, and this doesn't make a whole bunch of sense, but the host is Juno, which it is, you could hit enter. So if you were gathering logs from multiple Docker hosts where they both had uptime Kuma container names, this would filter on Juno, which I only have one server running, but if I said filter on tests, this will probably throw an error because I don't have one called test. But again, if I wanted to search for uptime Kuma, search, and then if we wanted to do the pipe equals the most intuitive thing, let's see, K3S, and enter. Now we just filtered all of our logs for the container name uptime Kuma that contain K3S in there. So pretty awesome, pretty powerful stuff. And so if you have 20, 30, 10, 2, however many containers running, now all of those logs will be captured inside of Loki just by editing the daemon.json and then having a config within Promtail. It's a lot of words, I know, but it'll make sense, I promise. Now, if you wanted to save this query, say in your favorites, you could bookmark this, or you could just go into query history, look at the last query we just ran, and then start it. And then to get back, let's say that was closed, go into query history, go into start, and then you can run this query. And the really cool thing about this is it fits within your ecosystem if you're already using Grafana. So a couple more things I mentioned I'll touch on real quick. Is syslogging. So you can actually set this up to be a syslog target for any of your devices. So let's say you're running systems that aren't containers. Let's say your network firewall, or your virtual machine, or your Windows machine, or your Raspberry Pi, and you want to pipe those logs into Loki as well. Well, you would just set up Promtail to host a syslogging endpoint. And so to set it up as a logging endpoint or a syslog receiver, we would add this configuration right here. So this configuration would actually go into Promtail. I'll put it in there because it'll make a little more sense. But if we were to add it to our Promtail configuration, we could add it here, and you could obviously comment this out, or you can add 2 jobs, but you can have multiple jobs. I just commented these out. But by adding this configuration, we have a job now called syslog. It's gonna listen on 0.0.0.0 on port 1514 and listen for syslogs to come in. And so if you enable this, then you're able to receive syslogs from any machine. Now, a word of advice. You should either format those syslogs going out or format them before they come into here. Now, it's not a big deal. Most of the time, they'll look pretty good, but depending on your device and how it formats syslogs, you might not see them in the way you would expect to see them within Grafana. And another thing before I forget, because I just noticed, this port 1514, you'll have to open up on your Promtail Docker config. But if you need help with configuring that, leave a comment below and we'll try to work through it. But that should be all you need to do. So the last thing I mentioned was Kubernetes. Not going to spend a ton of time on it, but you can apply the same idea that we applied to Docker to Kubernetes. So just think about it. In Kubernetes, you have many containers running, many pods running, and you want to get all of those logs inside of Loki. Well, you have a couple of options. One, you can spin up Promtail there and dump all of those logs into this container, or you could run your whole entire Loki stack in Kubernetes, which is super easy. There's a simple Helm command you can do to run it, and I'll actually have a blog post article in the documentation below of how to do it in Kubernetes. And literally, it took me 10 minutes to get running, if that. A lot faster than the Docker version, because most of it's pre-configured with Helm. Helm's just a package manager for Kubernetes. But anyways, once you get all of your containers dumping their standard out and standard error into Loki, it's really powerful. So here's my own home production version of Loki that's actually running in Kubernetes, and it's scraping all of the logs from my Kubernetes containers and dumping them into Loki. Kind of Inception, but it works great. So right away, if I do curly bracket, you can see I have lots of labels. So these are labels that are specific to Kubernetes that it already has and discovered. You can see I can type in container name equals, and I can see all of my containers that match this query. Then I can query this container and look at them. So not much different from the Docker version or any other version, but I get all of these labels automatically as these logs come in. So I could say the app Kubernetes IO instance is Loki and see the logs for Loki. Or I can say the chart is Prometheus and look at the logs for that. There's no logs there. It's a weird label, but you get the idea. Or I can say the specific pod name. You can see my pods, if I had multiple pods running, is my Techno Little Link server. You could see them here. And so you can see how powerful this is. I can log physical machines, network devices, Docker containers, Kubernetes clusters, and really anything really fast. And the nice part about it is it fits right into the Grafana ecosystem. It's always been compared to Prometheus, but for logs. And that seems exactly what it does for me. It takes that same idea of streams and labels and allows me to search and index and query the same way I would with Prometheus. And if you're familiar with Grafana, you can actually create dashboards as well based on some of these data just from these logs. Now, maybe I'll save that for another tutorial or a Grafana specific one, but it's all definitely possible. And if you're thinking about adding Grafana or maybe Prometheus, maybe adding Loki and logging will tip the scales for you. So what do you think of Grafana Loki? Do you like the idea of using Grafana to actually query your logs inside of Loki? Do you like a different logging system altogether? Let me know what your favorite logging system is in the comments section below. And remember, if you found anything in this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Man, you guys are lighting up my Raspberry Pi back there. I don't think it stopped. I don't think it stopped yet. So thank you, appreciate it. The thing is gonna blow up. No, it's not gonna blow up. If it does, I have automation in place to reboot it. So thank you so much, appreciate it.